Morning broke over Cheyenne Ridge with the church bell tolling long and heavy, a summons the whole town had been waiting on for weeks. Folks spilled into the dusty street in pressed dresses and polished boots, hats squared just so. Today, Thomas Graves, 32, a rancher with few words but a frame carved by work, was to wed Clorinda Whitmore, daughter of the richest merchant family this side of the divide. It wasn't a match born of love. Everyone knew that. It was a bargain between land and money, between the hard West and the polished East. Thomas had risen at first light. He buttoned the stiff collar, tugged the black tie snug, but the weight in his ash-gray eyes couldn't be hidden. His ranch had baked under a merciless sun. The grass lay dead, cattle thinned to bone. He needed the Whitmore dowry, or the bank would seize the very soil his father had handed down. This wedding wasn't a dream. It was the last rope to grab before the flood pulled him under. By 8, townsfolk had gathered outside the church, whispering sharp as needles. Wives speculated whether a porcelain-skinned lady could stomach the grind of ranch life. Men snickered, laying bets on how long the marriage would hold. 9 o'clock came. The church bell marked the hour, but no carriage from the Whitmore estate rattled into view. By 10, the word spread like wildfire. Clorinda was gone. Some said she'd run off the night before with a Mexican card-sharp jewelry box in tow. Mrs. Whitmore had found the bedroom empty. The dress hung abandoned on the window frame. The humiliation cut deep. For her family, it meant disgrace whispered for generations. Thomas stood on the church steps, fists locked so tight his knuckles shone white. The crowd's eyes burned into him, pity, mockery, and something meaner still. He'd have chosen a stampede or a wolf pack over this, a groom jilted before God and all of Cheyenne Ridge. Mrs. Whitmore, face pale but gaze aflame, refused to crumble. Her eyes cut across the yard, landing on Amara, the 20-year-old black maid clutching a basket of linens. "You," she hissed through her teeth, "put on the dress. This wedding goes on. My family will not be shamed." Silence fell hard. Amara froze, wide-eyed, her heart battering her ribs. Never had she dreamed of standing at the altar, least of all as a replacement. Yet the iron grip of her mistress left no room to refuse. She had served the Whitmores since girlhood. Disobedience meant ruin, cast out with nothing. They hustled her into the side room. The white gown slid over her shoulders, too long, too tight, heavy as chains. She stared at the mirror, dark skin against pale silk, coiled hair pressed beneath the veil, eyes brimming. The reflection looked like a stranger. When she stepped back into the chapel, a gasp rolled through the pews. Whispers rose sharp as hornets. A maid? A Negro girl? Thomas Graves marrying that? Thomas caught sight of her and felt his chest split like timber under an axe. He had braced himself for Clorinda, polished, pale, and proper. But here was Amara, the girl he'd seen bent over washtubs, lugging buckets, patching hems, and now the whole town stared, waiting for him to flinch. He could have turned and walked. He could have let the scandal swallow his name. But then he heard a snicker from somewhere in the crowd, cruel and cutting. Pride surged. No Graves would bow. Not today. He stepped forward, rough palm outstretched. Amara hesitated, then placed her trembling hand in his. For an instant, the calloused grip of a white rancher and the delicate fingers of a black servant locked together under the gaze of an entire town. The pastor stumbled through the vows, his voice quaking. Thomas answered with a firm, I do, slicing through the mutterings. Amara whispered hers, the words fragile as wind, tears slipping down her cheeks. When the final amen sounded, the room hung heavy. No applause, no blessings. Only stares thick with scorn, pity, and curiosity. Thomas led her down the steps, his hand clamped hard, hers cold as riverstone, yet neither let go. In the noonday sun they stood, bound together, not by love, not yet, but by a marriage sealed in humiliation and by the eyes of Cheyenne Ridge, which would follow them wherever they went. Thomas had no notion what tomorrow held for his ranch. Amara had no idea what shape her life would take now. But in that moment, both knew they were tied to each other, to survival, and to a storm of whispers that would not soon fade. The road back to the ranch stretched in a silence that pressed against the ribs. Amara sat at the edge of the wagon seat, her fingers laced tight, the wedding dress of Clorinda Whitmore drowning her small frame like a garment stolen from someone else's life. Each jolt of the wheels over ruts and stones dragged the hem across the red dirt, marking the trail behind them as if the land itself wished to remember she had entered this story by force, not choice. Beside her, Thomas kept his hands firm on the reins, his eyes locked on the rutted track. His face, cut from stone, betrayed nothing. Yet Amara felt the weight of him, the humiliation from the church steps that morning still burning on his broad shoulders, pressing down over them both like a heavy yoke. When the ranch came into view, it rose stark against the barren fields. A 2-story wooden house, dark as weathered oak, with no curtains, no flowers, no sign of softness. The windows looked out across the dry land like hollow eyes. Amara swallowed hard. This was to be her home. Thomas dismounted first, tying the horses. He turned, offering his rough palm. For half a heartbeat he hesitated, the distance between his calloused skin and her brown hand stretching wider than any canyon. Amara pulled back, bowing her head as she hurried up the steps alone. A small thing, gone in a breath, yet it thickened the air between them. Inside, the house felt colder than the Whitmore estate had ever been, though there it had been suffocating with grandeur. Here, everything was plain, pared down to wood and iron, stripped of any trace of comfort. No tablecloths, no painted frames, only the musk of old timber and the ghost of ash. Amara stood in the center, uncertain if a woman's presence had ever been imagined within these walls. Thomas showed her a small room upstairs. "This is for you," he said, voice no louder than a tired sigh. "I'll take the parlor." Then he was gone, leaving her with a narrow bed, a plain sheet, and a window looking out over brittle grass. She sank onto the mattress, the heavy gown pooling white around her feet like snow in a place where snow did not belong. For the first time since morning, tears fell. They sank into fabric that had never been meant for her. The days found a rhythm carved from silence. At dawn, she rose to kindle the stove, fumbling with the coarse pots and stubborn iron. She would hear the creak of the door, then the steady rhythm of hooves carrying Thomas out into the fields. At dusk, she watched him return, sweat soaking his shirt, reins clenched in tired hands. They met at the table each evening, with only the faint clink of fork against tin to mark the passing of time. No questions, no stories, just food swallowed heavy as gravel. Yet sometimes, in unguarded moments, their eyes brushed. She once bent over the well, pulling water hand over hand, and felt his gaze from the distance, lingering a moment too long before turning away as if caught, trespassing. And once she stood framed by the kitchen door, watching him labor against the dying light, his tall frame solitary beneath the blaze of sunset. Her heart stirred then, with a feeling she could not name, pity, awe, or some ache more dangerous. At night, the house deepened into quiet. The ticking of the clock echoed louder than it should have. Amara would lie awake listening to the faint shift of wood beneath his weight in the room below. Only a wall separated them, yet it felt like a canyon of miles. She thought of speaking, of breaking the silence with a question, about the cattle, the weather, even the bread on the table. But each time his stern eyes met hers, the words froze. He, too, never sought to cross the gulf. They lived as strangers under one roof, bound by vows neither had chosen, by paper that tied them tighter than any chain. In that house, silence was not absence. It was presence itself. It hung in the air, pressed on their movements, filled the spaces between stolen glances. And in that quiet, something faint began to stir. Not love, not yet, and not hope. Only the first, fragile threads of a bond, spun from necessity, from survival, from the shared knowledge that neither could walk away. Unseen, unnoticed even by themselves, those threads began to weave. 3 days after the wedding, the sky over Cheyenne Ridge carried the color of steel. Wind swept dust across the porch of the Graves Ranch, tugging loose the thin curtains Amara had stitched with clumsy thread. Inside, the sound of her needle tapping against cloth broke and faltered. She lowered her hands, fingers pricked and sore. The only garment she owned was still the white gown Mrs. Whitmore had forced upon her. Each time she looked at it, she heard again the murmur of suspicion from the pews. The door groaned. Thomas entered, boots scarred with dirt. He paused, his gaze resting on her longer than usual. His voice came low, steady. "Tomorrow, we'll ride into town. You'll need clothes of your own." Amara lifted her eyes, startled. She nodded. The words were plain, but they carried something she had not felt since stepping into this house. Acknowledgement. As though, at least in name, she belonged. The next day the town bustled with winter trade. Wagons groaned under sacks of flour, bolts of cloth, barrels of apples. When Thomas walked beside her, leading the mare by its reins, the air around them seemed to slow. Eyes clung to them with open judgment. "Graves married the Negro Maid," hissed a woman's voice. "Better a servant than a wife, I reckon," another sneered, followed by sharp laughter. Thomas did not turn, but the sinews in his forearm flexed hard around the leather strap. Amara lowered her gaze, letting the fall of her curls shadow her cheek. Each word pierced, small and cruel, leaving wounds unseen. In the dressmaker's shop, the proprietress hesitated. Her eyes skimmed Amara as though measuring someone unworthy. But when Thomas fixed her with that cold, ash-gray stare, the woman dropped her protest, fumbling for her tape and chalk. Amara tried plain cotton dresses, brown, soft blue, cut to fit her frame. The fabric clung in ways the heavy bridal gown never had. When she stepped out, Thomas's eyes caught for a fraction. Something flickered, unspoken. He turned quickly, pretending to study bolts of cloth, but she had seen it. They rode back in silence. The gulf between them remained, yet within it lay a narrow crack where recognition had seeped through. That evening, the scent of onions filled the kitchen. Amara bent over the stove, stirring soup, when hot grease leapt and kissed her skin. Ah! She gasped, dropping the spoon. Thomas came fast from the doorway. She cradled her hand, lips pressed tight. "Let me see," he muttered, voice rough but edged with concern. She shook her head, tried to turn, but his hand closed around her wrist. His palm was calloused, his touch unexpectedly warm. Her heart thudded as he pressed her gently into a chair, rummaging through a cabinet until he found a tin of salve. Kneeling across from her, he worked with surprising care, spreading ointment along the reddened flesh. His fingers trembled, not from clumsiness alone but from fear of hurting her. The marks on his own hands told stories of winters endured, of ropes and tools that had cut deep. She lifted her gaze and found his eyes, ash and storm, fixed on her with a quiet intensity. For a breath, the world stilled. No wind at the shutters, no bubbling soup, only two breaths weaving into one space. "All right," he said softly at last, withdrawing his hand as if scorched. He rose too quickly, turning away, hiding the awkwardness. Amara remained, her hand tingling with lingering warmth. Shame and sweetness tangled within her chest, a secret she dared not speak. But Thomas carried his burden heavy. The taverns buzzed with cruel talk. Graves was left at the altar, had to settle for a servant. The words gnawed at his pride. Each time he remembered, he closed himself further, keeping distance. And Amara, though longing for closeness, knew well she had not been chosen. She had been forced into a place never meant for her. The ranch by day clattered with hoofbeats, hammer strikes, the groan of gates. But by night it sank into a hush that seemed to deepen the shadows. Lying in her narrow bed, Amara often heard him shift restlessly below, as wakeful as she. Between them lay space too wide for words, yet beneath it something moved, quiet and unseen, like a stream beneath stone, waiting for its chance to rise toward the light. The summer sun bore down with a cruelty that left the land gasping. The ground split open in jagged veins, wounds that would not close. Grass snapped brittle beneath the faintest wind, scattering to dust across the fields. The cattle, once proud and sturdy, had dwindled into skin stretched over bone, eyes hollow, steps faltering. Each time Thomas looked upon them, his jaw tightened, as though he carried every failing beast upon his shoulders. Amara saw it too, the way each collapse carved another debt into him, another weight pressing harder on his frame. By day she carried water alongside him. The buckets bit into her shoulders, left red marks across her skin, but she never slowed her stride. The well's meager offering had to be divided. House, stock, and soil all thirsted. Thomas rarely allowed her heavy work, but in this season he did not send her away. They walked side by side across the parched earth, their shadows drawn long, their silence broken only by the hollow sound of boots on cracked clay. Once, when Amara staggered beneath the sting in her shoulder, Thomas reached swiftly, steadying the bucket. For a moment their eyes met. In his was something like regret, quickly hidden as he stepped back, letting her walk on. Yet that fleeting glance left her strangely lighter, not because her burden had eased, but because she had been seen. That night, the horizon darkened without warning. Thomas, hammer in hand at the fence line, noticed the sky turn sudden and strange. Wind rose, shrill and fierce, carrying grit that stung the eyes. He gathered tools in haste, then strode inside, voice clipped. "Sandstorm." Amara looked through the window. A wall of dust rolled across the plain, devouring the distance. The gale roared like 1,000 voices tearing at once. Thomas barred the doors, drew heavy cloth across the cracks. Yet still the dust found ways to seep through. He led her into the kitchen, the tightest room in the house. They sat across the worn table, a lantern between them casting frail yellow light. Outside, the storm slammed the walls with fists of fury. Sleep was impossible. Thomas reached into a drawer, withdrew a deck of cards bent from age. "To pass the hours," he murmured, eyes averted. Amara nodded. She had never played, but let him teach her. His hands were sure as he dealt, her own uncertain as she fumbled with the stiff paper. Once, when he set down a card, his fingers brushed hers. The warmth startled her, but he kept his gaze steady on the table as if nothing had happened. The storm raged, yet within that small circle of lantern glow they played on, slow and careful. Once she laughed softly at a lucky hand, and Thomas looked up. His eyes softened, just for a breath, as though the world outside and its burdens had slipped away. They both fell silent afterward, but the quiet between them had shifted. It felt less like a wall, more like a shared pause, a single breath held together. Hours passed. Still the storm screamed. Amara's head grew heavy, her lashes lowering. She slumped against the table edge, the lantern's light gilding the smooth curve of her cheek, the spill of her curls. Thomas reached to wake her, then stopped. She drifted sideways, her head finding his shoulder. He did not move. Her breath warmed the fabric of his shirt, steady and close. His chest pounded, as though the silence of months had cracked open in that touch. The house trembled beneath the storm's howl, but within the kitchen a hush fell different than before. Thomas did not dare lift his arm, did not gather her close, yet neither did he shift away. He sat still, allowing her weight, her warmth, to rest there. For the first time since the vows had bound them, his shoulders eased. Dawn bled pale through the slats as the storm passed on. Dust lay thick outside, the world muted in gray. Amara stirred, startled to find herself leaning against him. She pulled upright, cheeks burning, ready to stammer apology. "The storm's done," he said, voice rough, eyes fixed on the window. He never mentioned the night again. Neither did she. But when they cleared the table and their gazes crossed, something lingered in the air. A thread had formed, fragile and unseen, spun not by words but by a touch, a breath, a warmth carried through a night of fire and dust. The drought had not broken. Each day the sun bled more moisture from the earth. Each night the chill came sharper, as if the land itself wanted to remind them it could kill in more than one way. When darkness settled over the ranch, the air carried a new sound. Low at first, then rising. Long, hollow howls threading through the canyons, carried across the dry plains until they pressed against the house. Amara froze when she heard it. The sound made her ribs tighten. "Wolves," Thomas said simply, his voice steady as stone while he checked the chamber of his Winchester. His face betrayed nothing, but his eyes gleamed like steel in lantern light. Amara stood at the door, her lamp trembling in her hand. "They're close," she whispered. He glanced at her, gave one short nod. "Tonight, they'll test the fence." The scattered cries soon grew into a chorus. The herd outside shuddered and stomped, their frightened balls tearing at the night. Thomas wound a kerchief around his throat, then placed an old rifle in Amara's hands. "Ever fired one?" His voice was clipped. She swallowed, shook her head. He didn't waste breath on comfort. Instead, he cocked the lever and set the weapon against her palms. His hand brushed hers, calloused and sure, and the weight of that touch steadied her more than the gun itself. The night smelled of dust and cold. Together they stood at the fence line, their shadows stretching across the ground cracked by drought. Every sound outside seemed sharper, every flicker of movement a threat. Then, sudden as lightning, a wolf broke from the dark, eyes burning, teeth bared. "Shoot!" Thomas barked. Amara raised the rifle. Her shoulder trembled, but she pulled the trigger. The crack of the shot split the night, louder than thunder. The wolf tumbled, its form crumpling in the dust beneath the pale moon. For a moment, everything held still. Her chest hammered, breath ragged. When she turned, Thomas's eyes were wide, not with disbelief, but with something heavier, something that looked like respect. That look struck her harder than the recoil. The rest of the pack cried out, voices sharp with anger. But the gunfire had shaken their nerve. One by one they slipped back into shadow. The cattle quieted, stamping, but no longer frantic, steam rising from their nostrils in the cold night air. Thomas lowered her barrel with one hand. "Good," he said, voice low but firm. A single word, but it carried the weight of acknowledgement. Before she could answer, his hand moved higher. His thumb brushed her cheek, wiping away a smear of soot the lamp had left. The touch was clumsy, fleeting, but gentle enough to still her breath. For that instant, the world outside disappeared. No wolves, no dust, no watching eyes. Only the two of them within the circle of fence, breathing the same breath. Rancher and Maid, bound by nothing but survival, yet pulled together by something neither of them dared name. By the time they stepped back into the house, the sky was paling at the edges. The kitchen lamp sputtered weakly, throwing their twin shadows across the walls. Amara laid the rifle on the table, her hands still shaking with the echo of the shot. Thomas poured water into a tin cup and pushed it toward her. "Better than I expected," he muttered, his gaze fixed on the flames in the stove. She lowered her eyes, lips trembling, but inside her chest something warmed, not because of the words themselves, but because in his voice she heard recognition. She was not only a burden, not only an accident forced into his life. For the first time she had stood beside him, not behind. Thomas lingered a moment, then rose, stepping onto the porch. The first light of morning touched his frame as he moved into it, his figure swallowed by the horizon. Amara watched from the kitchen, her hand still tingling from where he had touched her face. In her chest, something small but undeniable flickered. Not yet love, not yet trust, but the sense of a bond forged in danger, in fire and dust and blood, that could not easily be undone. From this night on, whether they spoke of it or not, they were no longer two strangers under one roof. They were a pair, standing shoulder to shoulder against the wild. That night, the Wyoming sky pressed low, heavy with black clouds. The wind howled through the gaps in the shutters, carrying the smell of parched earth and the sharp edge of early autumn cold. Inside the ranch house, the fire in the hearth had dwindled to ash. Only the flicker of a lantern kept the darkness at bay, its flame casting long, unsteady shadows across Thomas seated at the table. Before him stood an open bottle of whiskey and a half-drained glass. He drank slowly, each swallow burning down his throat, but nothing eased the knot that had grown tight in his chest. Since the wedding, they had worked side by side, shared meals, even stood together at the fence with rifles in hand. Yet the distance between them remained, invisible but thick, a fog that refused to lift. The soft tread of footsteps drew his gaze. Amara emerged from the kitchen, her hair tumbling loose against her shoulders, her plain cotton dress fitted close to her frame. She hesitated near the doorway, then moved toward him, every step deliberate. "You're still awake," she said softly, her voice as fragile as the flame. Thomas poured another measure of whiskey, but did not answer. Amara sat opposite, her dark eyes catching the lantern glow, uncertain, yet steady with a kind of resolve. "I know I am not the wife you ever wanted," she said at last, her hands clenched together. "I was pulled into that dress only because your bride ran. If one day you want another, I won't stand in the way." Her voice broke on the last words, each one cutting her as it left her lips. She lowered her head, bracing for the silence that so often met her. But Thomas did not look away. His stare held hers, unblinking, until her breath stuttered. Finally, he set the glass down, the soft thud echoing in the room. "That day," he said, voice rough, "with all eyes watching, you could have refused. But you walked to the altar with me. No one else did. Only you." Amara's eyes lifted, wide with surprise. He reached across the table, covering her trembling hands with his. His skin was coarse and warm, hers soft, uncertain. That single touch seemed to still the air around them. "From tomorrow," he said, slow and steady, "we live as husband and wife, not in name only." Her heart hammered. Fear, wonder, and a warmth she could not name surged together. She could not answer with words. Her eyes spoke in their place, holding his longer than she had dared before. The weeks of silence, the heavy walls between them, cracked. Thomas rose, circling the table. Amara stood, her hands still bound in his. Step by step they drew closer, until breath mingled, sharp and heated in the small space between. Thomas hesitated, as though giving her room to step back. But Amara did not. Her eyes, dark and trembling, shone with determination. In that moment both knew this was not compulsion, this was choice. He bent and brushed his mouth against hers, tentative, questioning. She answered, lips quivering, yet yielding. From that first contact, a flame spread through them both, hungry and unrelenting. They moved together toward her room, no words needed. Only touches, glances, and the fierce hush that grew around them. For the first time his hands traced her skin, not to command, not to mend, but to cherish. And for the first time her hand pressed to his chest, feeling the thunder of his heart match her own. Every gesture began cautious, then deepened. Exploration met with answer, heat with trembling need. Their breath came ragged, mingling in the dark. There was no haste, no harshness, only desire long restrained breaking free, finding its place between them. That night, they became husband and wife, not by shame, not by decree, but by choice made together. Morning seeped soft and golden through the window. Amara stirred, hair loose across the pillow, her shoulder warm where Thomas's arm lay draped. His breathing was steady, his face eased of the hardness that had always marked it. She watched him, wonder rising in her chest, a feeling she had not known in years, peace and something that tasted like hope. She closed her eyes again, smiling faintly. Outside, the drought still held, the whispers of town still lingered, the struggles ahead still waited. But inside that small room, a true beginning had taken root. Autumn swept across Cheyenne Ridge on winds that scraped the skin and left the air dry as tinder. With it came the past, cloaked in dust and disgrace. One bleak morning, a carriage rolled into town, its wheels rattling like bones. From it stepped Clorinda Whitmore, the bride who had vanished. But the woman who stood before the gawking crowd bore little resemblance to the polished daughter of wealth. Her hair hung in tangled strands. Her dress was frayed and dulled, her cheeks hollowed by hunger. Word ran quick as prairie fire. The gold she'd fled with had been taken by the Mexican gambler who abandoned her at the border. Clorinda had returned empty-handed, stripped of fortune, yet her pale eyes still glimmered with the pride that had always carried her. She had come to claim what she believed remained hers. Only days later, Clorinda appeared in the church, her voice sharp and clear before the congregation. "Thomas Graves is my husband," she declared. "The wedding was meant for me. That servant girl wore my gown to hide my family's shame." Gasps rippled through the pews. Amara sat at the back, her chest tightening with every word. The stares burned, mocking, cruel. "A maid playing wife," she heard someone hiss. Laughter, like knives, cut deep. That evening, Mrs. Whitmore herself arrived at the ranch. She carried her authority into the parlor as if she still owned the walls. She lowered herself into the chair by the hearth, spine straight, eyes cold. "Mr. Graves," she began, voice edged with iron, "my daughter is your rightful wife. This girl," her gaze slashed toward Amara, words bitten with scorn, "is nothing but a servant dressed in borrowed silk. She has no claim." The room thickened. Amara stood near the wall, her back rigid, though her hands trembled at her sides. Each word struck like a blade. Servant. Imposter. Thomas had listened in silence, but now he set his glass down hard on the table, the sound ringing heavy. His gray eyes lit like flint as he raised them to meet the matriarch's stare. "Mrs. Whitmore," his voice was rough, slow but unyielding, "you will not insult Amara in my house. She was the one who stood with me before that altar. No one else. She bore the shame, the stares, the scorn. Not your daughter. Amara." The words struck Amara as if the ground had shifted. She had never heard such defense from him, not once since the vows. Her heart stumbled, caught between disbelief and wonder. Mrs. Whitmore's face blanched, then hardened into steel. "You cannot change truth. Clorinda is your wife. This maid will never measure against her." Thomas leaned forward, both hands flat against the table, his voice dropping into the weight of stone. "The truth is that Clorinda ran. Amara did not. If she had turned away that day, I would have stood alone at the altar, shamed beyond repair. She spared me that. She saved me from it." Silence fell, broken only by the hiss of wind through the cracks. Amara's throat ached with the swell of unspoken tears. She held them back, though her vision blurred. Mrs. Whitmore glared, lips pressed thin. Finally she exhaled, sharp and bitter. "You will regret this. The town will never accept such a union. Never." Thomas did not answer at once. His gaze slid to Amara, small, trembling, yet unbroken. Her dark eyes met his without flinching for the first time. He turned back, voice measured, final. "Perhaps I will regret many things. But know this, in this house Amara is my wife, and no one will disgrace her here." The matriarch rose, skirts snapping with her movement. She strode out, the door slamming against its frame, leaving the house quivering in her wake. The silence that followed was heavy, ringing with what had been spoken. Amara stood rooted. His words still echoed, searing her heart. Protection, defense, recognition, not of duty alone, but of her. Thomas turned at last, his eyes lingering on her. They exchanged no words. None were needed. In the look he gave her, Amara understood. For the first time, he had not spoken to guard his own pride. He had spoken for her. That night, the lamp burned low. In the narrow room, Amara lay on her side, her back to him. The quiet pressed thick, every sound magnified. The shift of his weight on the bed, the long, weary sigh he let slip, as though the weight of all Cheyenne Ridge had settled on him. Amara shut her eyes, heart restless. She wanted to turn, to ask, "Do you regret standing for me?" But the words caught in her throat, for fear his answer would break her. So they lay side by side in silence. The space between them was no more than a hand's breadth, yet it felt both closer and farther than ever. Amara knew then. The past had returned, and soon Thomas would have to choose. Between the fragile bond they had begun to build, and the ghost of a life Clorinda had left behind. The church bell tolled over Cheyenne Ridge on Sunday morning, not in summons to worship, but to gather the whole town for a spectacle. A trial, not of crime, but of marriage. Who was the true wife of Thomas Graves? Folks packed the pews, their faces alight with hunger for drama. Never before had they seen a union dragged into the open like this, the altar turned into a stage for shame. On one side stood Clorinda Whitmore, once the jewel of her family, now returned with a hollow face and ragged dress, but with pride unbroken. On the other stood Amara, the black maid who had been forced into the gown that day, who had since lived at the Graves Ranch as his wife in all but name. The air inside was thick, charged like a storm about to break. Clorinda mounted the front, her voice ringing sharp as a blade. "People of Cheyenne Ridge, I am Thomas's rightful bride. That wedding was mine. The maid was a cover for disgrace. She has no claim." Whispers rippled, some heads nodding, others frowning. Clorinda pressed on, pulling a crumpled letter from her dress. This is proof, a letter from Amara herself, written in tears to her friend. She said she was forced into the gown. She said it was no choice of hers. She raised it high. The room erupted. Stares cut toward Amara, pitying, mocking, cold. Amara rose slowly, hands trembling but her gaze steady. She stepped forward, her voice quiet yet carrying to the far corners. "The words in that letter are true. That day I was forced. I wept. I felt nothing but shame. That is the past." Gasps rustled through the pews. Amara drew breath, her dark eyes sweeping the crowd. "Since that day I stayed. I carried water. I cooked. I mended the house. I stood beside Thomas when the wolves came to the fence. I did not run. Because somewhere along that road, I chose. I chose to stay. I chose to love." Her final words fell like iron on stone, silencing the murmur. Some shifted uncomfortably. Others glanced at one another, recalling nights they had seen her hauling buckets, seen her shoulder a rifle at Graves's side. The minister, grave-faced, turned to Thomas. "It is time, Mr. Graves. Whom do you name as your lawful wife?" Every gaze pinned him where he sat. He rose, tall and unflinching, his shoulders broad as oak. His eyes passed over Clorinda, then found Amara. He stepped forward, voice deep and certain. "Yes, the wedding was meant for Clorinda. But Clorinda fled, leaving me at the altar. The only one who stood beside me was Amara. And since that day, not once has she left me. Clorinda carried gold when she ran. Amara carried her heart when she stayed. He turned fully to Amara, his gaze warm for the first time beneath the eyes of the whole town. Amara is my wife. Before God and before Cheyenne Ridge, I choose her. Silence swallowed the room, heavy and electric. Then came whispers, then scattered nods. A few stood, clapping hesitant at first, then firm. Clorinda's face drained, white, her silver eyes sparking with fury. She shrieked, voice sharp enough to crack glass. "You choose her? A maid in a stolen gown? You will be a laughingstock, Thomas Graves. You will regret this until you die." She flung the letter to the floor, skirts whipping as she stormed down the aisle. The doors burst wide, her heels striking hard, her rage echoing into the autumn air. Mrs. Whitmore followed, pale and shaken, her authority stripped away. Inside, Amara stood frozen, her pulse racing. Thomas turned, walked straight to her, and held out his hand. Her small fingers slipped into his, trembling yet firm. Something shifted in the room. The disdain in the eyes of the townsfolk softened into something quieter. Not all approved, but few could deny what they had seen. A man choosing not out of pride or necessity, but out of conviction. That night, back at the ranch, Amara sat on the edge of the bed. Clorinda's shrill words still echoed. The judgment of the town still weighed heavy. But beneath it all, one truth glowed steady. Thomas had chosen. For the first time, she carried a name not of servant, but of wife. The sky over Cheyenne Ridge turned to lead, heavy and unyielding. Winter had not yet come, but the chill in the air warned of storms gathering, not only in the heavens, but in men's hearts. Clorinda and her mother had vanished after the trial in the church, yet their absence was no peace. Whispers carried word of their next move. The Whitmores had joined hands with Frank Morrison, the most ruthless moneylender west of the Platte, and they meant to reclaim honor in the only way they knew, through power and ruin. The letter came on a cold morning. Thomas read it once, his jaw set like stone. Graves' ranch, already cracked beneath drought, now stood under Morrison's claim. The man had purchased every note from the bank. Unless payment came within a month, the land would pass into his hands. Morrison himself rode up before noon. He sat tall in a leather coat, his hat brim low, the grin on his face sharp as a blade. "Graves," he drawled, "I own your debt. In 30 days, this place is mine. Unless, of course, you take the easier road. Cast off that maid you call wife, bind yourself back to Clorinda, and the slate is clean." Thomas stood on the porch, broad shoulders squared, eyes gray as winter steel. Beside him, Amara held her hands tightly before her silence ringing louder than any plea. "Amara is my wife," Thomas said. His voice was iron. Morrison's smile curdled into mockery. He turned to Amara, his words poisoned with scorn. "Wife? The whole town knows better. You're nothing but a servant in stolen lace. A black maid will never sit equal with a Whitmore. All you've done is turn Graves into a fool." Amara bit her lip, spine rigid, though her heart pounded. The insult was no stranger, yet spoken here, before Thomas, it cut deeper than ever. She braced for his silence, but Thomas stepped forward, placing his body between her and Morrison. "If you speak against my wife again," he said, voice low and rumbling, "I'll see you regret it." Morrison's smirk faltered, but men like him did not retreat. Days later, He returned with 3 of his roughest hands. The sun fell red over the prairie when Amara heard the tramp of boots in the yard. Thomas led his horse from the corral, but stopped as Morrison planted himself at the fence, hand resting on the butt of his revolver. "Time's up, Graves," Morrison spat. "Sell me the ranch, or watch it burn with that girl inside." Thomas met his stare, unmoving. "This land is my father's blood. I don't sell." The wind rose, lifting dust in spirals. For a breath, the world held still. Then Morrison drew first. The shot cracked the dusk. Thomas shoved Amara aside, the bullet tearing into the post behind her. His own gun roared in answer, grazing Morrison's shoulder. The man bellowed, stumbling back, as his men surged forward with pistols drawn. Amara's hands shook, but memory flared. The night of the wolves, the rifle heavy in her grasp. She seized the Wasun Winchester from beside the door. Her palms slick with sweat, she raised it. When one of Morrison's thugs lunged, she fired. The man spun, collapsed in the dust, eyes wide in disbelief. Thomas felled another with a single clean shot. But a third bullet found him, biting into his shoulder. He dropped to one knee, teeth clenched against the pain. Amara screamed, dragging him behind the doorframe as bullets splintered wood. She pressed against him, hearing the ragged pull of his breath. Her heart quaked, yet her grip tightened on the rifle. The fight lasted minutes, but felt endless. Morrison, bloodied but not broken, cursed as he staggered back with his last man. His voice carried over the yard. "Graves, you'll lose it all. The town will see you fall." Then they were gone, swallowed by the dark. The ranch lay scarred, pocked with holes, blood staining the porch. Neighbors came swift, drawn by the thunder of gunfire. They saw the trail of red on the boards, saw Amara supporting Thomas, her small frame straining under his weight. And whispers changed. She took up the rifle. She stood her ground beside him. She saved his life. Where once there had been sneers, now voices carried awe. No one could call her imposter, not after the sight of her with smoke curling from the barrel, standing over her wounded husband. That night, Amara sat by his bed, her hand pressed hard against the bleeding wound. His face was pale, yet his eyes stayed open, fixed on hers. "You shouldn't have stepped in front of me," she whispered, tears streaking down her cheeks. He managed a strained smile. "If I had the choice again, I'd do the same. You're my wife." Amara bent forward, pressing her brow to his hand, her shoulders shaking. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, carrying the scent of smoke and dust. Inside, another truth took root, one forged in gunfire, carved in blood. Their love was no longer hidden in silence or shadow. It had been proven before the town, before God, against Morrison's fury itself. From that night on, no one could deny what they were: husband and wife, bound not by shame but by choice, and by the fire they had endured together. Morning broke strange over Cheyenne Ridge. The town did not stir with the usual clatter of hooves and smoke rising from scattered cabins. Instead, every man and woman walked toward the oak-built federal courthouse that loomed in the center square. A rare session had been called. Thomas Graves had brought suit against Frank Morrison for the bloodshed on his ranch, where Amara had nearly been slain and where Thomas himself had bled to shield her. Inside, the scent of pine lingered sharp, the tall windows pouring thin shafts of light onto the judge's bench. The benches overflowed with townsfolk, many of them the same who once mocked Amara. Today they came to watch whether a lone rancher could stand against Morrison, the man who held most of their debts in his fist. Morrison sat at the defense table, dressed in black, his bandaged wound long healed. Beside him glowered Whitmore, eyes glittering with malice. Across from them, Thomas kept his back straight, despite the white cloth binding his shoulder. Amara sat at his side, her hands folded in her lap, fingers pale from the force of her grip. The gavel fell. The federal judge, silver-haired and stern, spoke with the weight of law. This court will hear the matter of armed intrusion at the Graves Ranch, and the question of lawful marriage tied to it. Plaintiff, Thomas Graves, present your case. Thomas rose. His voice was gravel, roughened by injury, yet steady. Your Honor, Morrison and his men came to my land armed. They threatened my wife's life. I carry this wound because I stood between them and her. This is no quarrel of debt. It was a crime. Murmurs rustled through the benches. Amara's heart jolted when she heard it plain, spoken before all. My wife. Morrison sneered as he stood. Your Honor, Graves owes more than he can pay. I came to bargain. He drew first. As for the woman, his gaze cut sideways, dripping contempt. The town knows she's but a maid shoved into silk. That marriage was never real. A ripple of whispers. Whitmore leaned forward, voice sharp. Correct. My daughter Clorinda is his true wife. The air soured. Amara bowed her head, her hands twisting tight, shame rising in her throat. Then came a cough from the back. A man stepped forward, weather-worn, clothes frayed, his limp dragging him into the light. Gasps spread as folk recognized him. My name is Samuel Dyer, he rasped. Morrison hired me, and others, to ride against Graves. He wanted us to break the woman, to humiliate her, so Graves would yield. I refused, but I swear before God, those were his words. The room erupted, faces turned, mouths open, all eyes on Morrison. His skin flushed red, then drained white. Whitmore spluttered, his voice cracking. He lies! A drunk, a worthless tramp! The gavel hammered. Order! The judge thundered. The judge's gaze shifted to Amara. Do you wish to speak? She stood, her knees trembling, yet her voice steadied as she went. It is true. At first I was forced into that gown. I felt no more than a shadow, a stand-in. But from that day forward, I stayed. I bore water, I mended walls, I faced the wolves at the fence. I stood in the storm and in the gunfire. And Thomas bled because he would not let me fall. What we have is not words on a page. It is life, lived together each day. The silence that followed was absolute. Every soul in that room had seen some part of what she spoke. No one laughed now. The judge paused long, then delivered his ruling. This court recognizes the marriage between Thomas Graves and Amara as lawful. Clorinda Whitmore, by fleeing, abandoned her claim. As for the suit, evidence stands against Morrison. Yet the plaintiff offers a settlement. Mr. Graves, your proposal? Thomas stepped forward. Grant me 1 year to repay my debt. If Morrison accepts, I will withdraw the charge. I seek not vengeance, but the chance to rebuild my ranch. Morrison's mouth twisted, ready to protest. But the gavel fell again, and the muttering crowd pressed like a tussid. He swallowed, forced to bow his head. 1 year, he spat. Then I'll take the land if you fail. The judge's gavel struck wood. So ordered. Court adjourned. The townsfolk poured into the street, buzzing with voices. Yet many eyes turned toward Amara, no longer with scorn, but with something closer to respect. On the courthouse steps, Thomas turned to her. The noon light fell on his bandaged shoulder, on her trembling hands. He caught them in his own, his voice low but certain. 1 year, Amara. We'll start again. Together. Her eyes brimmed, but they shone. She nodded, the wordless promise sealing between them. She was no maid in a borrowed gown now. She was his wife, by law, by love, by the strength they had forged in fire. That evening, back at the ranch, Amara built the fire while Thomas stacked the logs. Flames leapt, throwing warmth into the small room. For the first time in weeks, their smiles broke freely. Outside, the wind carried the chill of oncoming winter. But within the wooden walls, another fire had taken root, one not easily put out. From that night, their work began anew, not only to pay a debt, but to build a legacy, a home born from blood, tears, and a choice made by them both. That winter dragged on heavy, but inside the Graves Ranch, another season quietly began to take root. After the courthouse, Thomas and Amara no longer whispered questions about whether the town would accept them. The only question that remained was how to endure, how to keep the land handed down by Thomas's father, and how to honor the vow they had spoken beneath the federal judge's gaze. Each day began before the dawn. Amara rose to stir the ashes, her fingers buried in cold soot, her eyes still heavy with sleep, yet her lips curved in a soft smile when Thomas came down in his thick coat. Their breakfast was plain, black coffee and hard bread, but it became the fuel for hours of unyielding labor. She never shied from the weight of work. When Thomas hauled timber, she braced the rope beside him. When he drove the herd, she gathered the strays. Hands once soft grew calloused and cracked, but Amara did not complain. To Thomas, those hands were no longer the hands of a maid forced into vows. They were the hands of a true partner, an equal in every trial. In the first months, they sold off a few prized horses and the old wagon to pay down the interest. Then Amara set her mind to planting rows of vegetables, churning butter, and carrying baskets of eggs to market. At first, the townsfolk scoffed, but when they saw her return each week with steady goods and a patient smile, their voices softened. From a distance, Thomas watched her among the stalls, saw how the eyes that once held scorn now held something else. The whispers changed. She works harder than most. She keeps her head high. It was the beginning of respect Amara had never dreamed she might earn. By the 4th month, rains broke the drought, and the prairie stirred green once more. Thomas rebuilt the fences while Amara sowed fresh grass for the herd. They labored until sunset painted the horizon in fire. Many nights they collapsed onto the porch steps, too tired for words. Yet when Amara rested her head against his shoulder, Thomas knew no burden was too heavy when carried together. By the 6th month, more than half the debt was gone. Morrison's smile thinned to bitterness, but the coins Thomas laid on the table were honest, and no man could deny them. In town, those who once favored Clorinda began to turn. No one could argue against the sight of the couple working side by side, never grumbling, bound by quiet resolve and a love written plain in every gesture. By the 8th month, under the wide sky of market day, Thomas laid down the last stack of bills. He watched as Morrison's hand tore the paper bond, the rip echoing like chains snapping free. Rage darkened the man's face, but he could do nothing. "You've won, Graves," he muttered through clenched teeth. Thomas gave no reply. He only clasped Amara's hand, steady and sure, letting the town see clearly who had walked with him through fire and storm. Back at the ranch, Amara stood on the porch, her gaze sweeping the Sassoon, fields now brushed in green. Wind lifted her dark curls. Sunlight warmed her skin. Thomas stepped behind her, his arm circling her shoulders. "We did it," he whispered. Amara turned, eyes shining. "Not you. Us." Thomas searched her face, then bent to kiss her. A kiss no longer uncertain, but full of trust and reverence. In that moment, they knew the legacy they had built was not only a reclaimed ranch, but a testament that love, chosen and proven, could rise above color, class, and the merciless land itself. That night, they sat by the hearth. Thomas carved into a small plank of wood, each stroke slow, deliberate. Amara leaned close as the words took shape. "Where love is chosen, the land will live." When he fixed the board above the door, Amara rested her head against him. The wind swept over the grasslands, carrying the scent of rain-soaked earth. Their quiet laughter rose with it, threading into the dark. The Graves Ranch, once nearly lost to drought, to debt, to scorn, now stood as proof of something greater. It was no longer a story of shame or survival. It was a legacy of love. Many years had passed since the day Morrison tore up the note and rode out of Cheyenne Ridge defeated. The prairie that had once cracked under drought and prejudice now stretched in soft green, alive again. The Graves Ranch, once trembling on the edge of ruin, stood as one of the most thriving, steady places in the territory. On the front porch, a boy with light skin and eyes the color of gray ash, mixed with deep brown, struggled over an old primer. Amara sat beside him, her arm curved gently around his back, guiding each sound. Ma, land," the boy stammered. Amara's smile warmed her face. She set her hand upon his tight curls. "That's right, Ezra. You read it true." The boy laughed, hugging the book to his chest. The spark in his eyes filled Amara's heart so fully, she thought she had stepped clear out of every shame-filled day behind her. She was no longer the maid forced into a wedding gown. She was a wife, a mother, the keeper of a home born from love freely chosen. Out in the pasture, hoofbeats drummed steady and sure. Thomas rode tall upon his bay stallion. Ezra perched behind him, small hands clutching the saddle horn. "Straighten your back, son," Thomas called, his voice gravelly yet proud. A horse feels the rider's confidence. Ezra lifted his chin, grinning wide. "Like you, Pa." Their laughter carried across the fields, answered by the land itself, as though to remind them that this was now their inheritance. At dusk, the sky turned copper and crimson. Wind sang through the new cedar fence lines, and the sun fell low over the herd grazing in peace. Amara and Thomas stood together on the porch, while Ezra ran wild across the grass, arms stretched as if he could gather the horizon into his chest. Thomas wrapped his arm around Amara's shoulders, her hair brushing his jaw. His gray eyes no longer held the shadow of shame, only rest. "Do you remember the first day we walked into this house?" he murmured. Amara nodded. "I was so afraid I shook, but you didn't turn from me, and I didn't turn from you." Thomas's hand tightened over her shoulder. "That's what saved us." Morning came with a golden rise across the prairie. The three of them stepped onto the porch together, Ezra clutching his book, Thomas leading his horse, Amara carrying a basket of fresh bread. They looked out over the wide fields, wind coursing steady, the cattle moving slow and strong. Standing there, hand in hand, they knew the ranch was not only soil and wood. It was proof of love weathered through every storm, proof meant to be handed down. So, friends, maybe in the autumn of our lives, we have seen loves falter and loves endure. That makes the truth cut deeper. Love does not need perfection. It needs two hearts willing to stay. If this story has stirred even a single beat within you, give us a like, a subscription, and leave your own memory in the comments. For your stories too are a legacy, proof that love, at any age, in any place, bears the strength to outlast time itself. Tell us, was there ever a hand that held yours through a storm? Was there ever an eye that gave you courage to keep walking? Thank you for traveling this trail with us. We'll meet again in the next story, out where the prairie still runs wide and where Wild West love stories wait for us to believe once more.